Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, episode 490. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, Part 2. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters. Today, I will continue with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Here, the author tells the story of the United States through various groups of people, such as Native Americans, poor people, slaves, wealthy landowners, and others. Today's show will have no new background footage. Unfortunately, I didn't have any time to hike over the last couple of weeks. So now, let's continue with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Each harsher measure of British control, the Proclamation of 1763, not allowing colonists to settle beyond the Appalachians, the stamp tax, the Townshend taxes, including the one on tea, the stationing of troops, and the Boston Massacre, the closing of the port of Boston, and the dissolution of the Massachusetts legislature escalated colonial rebellion to the point of revolution. The colonists had responded with the Stamp Act Congress, the Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence, the Boston Tea Party, and finally, in 1774, the setting up of a Continental Congress, an illegal body, forerunner of a future independent government. It was after the military clash at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 between colonial Minutemen and British troops that the Continental Congress decided on separation. They organized a small committee to draw up the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote. It was adopted by Congress on July 2nd and officially proclaimed July 4th, 1776. Now, let's go to page 84 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. One would look in examining the revolution's effect on class relations at what happened to land confiscated from fleeing loyalists. It was distributed in such a way as to give a double opportunity to the revolutionary leaders to enrich themselves and their families, and to parcel out some land to small farmers to create a broad base of support for the new government. Indeed, this became characteristic of the new nation, finding itself possessed of enormous wealth. It could create the richest ruling class in history and still have enough for the middle classes to act as a buffer between the rich and the dispossessed. The huge land holdings of the Loyalists had been one of the great incentives to the Revolution. Lord Fairfax in Virginia had more than 5 million acres encompassing 21 counties. Lord Baltimore's income from his Maryland holdings exceeded £30,000 a year. After the Revolution, Lord Fairfax was protected he was a friend of George Washington. But other loyalist holders of great estates, especially those who were absentees, had their land confiscated. In New York, the number of freeholding small farmers increased after the Revolution, and there were fewer tenant farmers who had created so much trouble in the pre-Revolution years. Now, let's go to page 87. When the war ended in 1763, the French, ignoring their old allies, ceded to the British lands west of the Appalachians. The Indians therefore united to make war on the British western forts. This is called Pontiac's conspiracy by the British, but a liberation war for independence in the words used by Francis Jennings. Under orders from British General Geoffrey Amherst, the commander of Fort Pitts gave the attacking Indian chiefs, with whom he was negotiating, blankets from the smallpox hospital. It was a pioneering effort at what is now called biological warfare. An epidemic soon spread among the Indians. Despite this and the burning of villages, the British could not destroy the will of the Indians, who continued guerrilla war. A peace was made, with the British agreeing to establish a line at the Appalachians, beyond which settlements would not encroach on Indian territory. This was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and it angered Americans. The original Virginia Charter said its land went westward to the ocean. It helps to explain why most of the Indians fought for England during the Revolution. With their French allies, then their English allies gone, the Indians faced a new land-coveting nation, alone. Now, let's go to page 88. The situation of black slaves as a result of the American Revolution was more complex. Thousands of blacks fought with the British. 5,000 were with the revolutionaries, most of them from the North, but there were also free blacks from Virginia and Maryland. The lower South was reluctant to arm blacks. Amid the urgency and chaos of war, thousands took their freedom, leaving on British ships at the end of the war to settle in England, Nova Scotia, the West Indies, or Africa. Many others stayed in America as free blacks, evading their masters. In the northern states, the combination of blacks in the military, the lack of powerful economic need for slaves, and the rhetoric of revolution led to the end of slavery, but very slowly. As late as 1810, 30,000 blacks, 1/4 of the black population of the North, remained slaves. In 1840, there were still 1,000 slaves in the North. In the Upper South, there were more free Negroes than before, leading to more control legislation. In the Lower South, slavery expanded with the growth of rice and cotton plantations. Now, let's go to page 90 at the bottom of the page and continuing on to page 91 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Beard applied this general idea to the Constitution by studying the economic backgrounds and political ideas of the 55 men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draw up the Constitution. He found that the majority of them were lawyers by professions, that most of them were men of wealth, in land, slaves, manufacturing, or shipping, that half of them had money loaned out as interest, and that 40 of the 55 held government bonds, according to the records of the Treasury Department. Thus, Beard found that most of the makers of the Constitution had some direct economic interest in establishing a strong federal government. The manufacturers needed protective tariffs. The moneylenders wanted to stop the use of paper money to pay off debts. The land speculators wanted protection as they invaded Indian lands. Slave owners needed federal security against slave revolts and runaways. Bondholders wanted a government able to raise money by nationwide taxation to pay off those bonds. Four groups, Beard noted, were not represented in the Constitutional Convention: slaves, indentured servants, women, men without property. And so the Constitution did not reflect the interests of those groups. Now, let's go to page 97 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Madison's argument can be seen as a sensible argument for having a government which can maintain peace and avoid continuous disorder. But is it the aim of government simply to maintain order as a referee between two equally matched fighters? Or is it that government has some special interest in maintaining a certain kind of order, a certain distribution of power and wealth, a distribution in which government officials are not neutral referees, but participants? In that case, the disorder they might worry about is the disorder of popular rebellion against those monopolizing the society's wealth. This interpretation makes sense when one looks at the economic interests, the social backgrounds of the makers of the Constitution. Now, let's go to page 98. The Constitution was a compromise between slave-holding interests of the South and moneyed interests of the North. For the purpose of uniting the 13 states into one great market for commerce, the Northern delegates wanted laws regulating interstate commerce and argued that such laws require only a majority of Congress to pass. The South agreed to this in return for allowing the trade in slaves to continue for 20 years before being outlawed. Now, let's go to page 99. The Constitution became even more acceptable to the public at large after the first Congress, responding to criticism, passed a series of amendments known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments seem to make the new government a guardian of people's liberties to speak, to publish, to worship, to petition, to assemble, to be tried fairly, to be secure at home against official intrusion. It was, therefore, perfectly designed to build popular backing for the new government. What was not made clear, it was a time when the language of freedom was new and its reality untested, was the shakiness of anyone's liberty when entrusted to a government of the rich and powerful. Now, let's go to page 112 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The assumption is twofold. The American female was supposed to be so infinitely lovable and provocative that a healthy male could barely control himself when in the same room with her. And the same girl, as she comes out of the cocoon of her family's protectiveness, is so palpitating with undirected affection, so filled to the brim with tender feelings, that she fixes her love on the first person she sees. She awakes from the midsummer night's dream of adolescence, and it is the responsibility of her family and society to see that her eyes fall on a suitable match and not some clown with the head of an ass. They do their part by such restrictive measures as segregated by sex and or class, schools, dancing classes, travel, and other external controls. She is required to exert the inner control of obedience. The combination forms a kind of societal chastity belt, which is not unlocked until the marriage partner has arrived and adolescence is formally over. Now, let's go to page 129. These treaties, these land grabs, laid the basis for the Cotton Kingdom, the slave plantations. Every time a treaty was signed, pushing the Creeks from one area to the next, promising them security there, whites would move into the new area and the Creeks would feel compelled to sign another treaty, giving up more land in return for security elsewhere. Jackson's work had brought the white settlements to the border of Florida, owned by Spain. Here were the villages of the Seminole Indians, joined by some Red Stick refugees, and encouraged by British agents in their resistance to the Americans. Settlers moved into Indian lands. Indians attacked. Atrocities took place on both sides. When certain villages refused to surrender people accused of murdering whites, Jackson ordered the villages destroyed. Now, let's go to page 136 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The forces that led to removal did not come Van Every insists, from the poor white frontiersmen who were neighbors of the Indians. They came from industrialization and commerce, the growth of populations, of railroads in cities, the rise in value of land, and the greed of businessmen. Party managers and land speculators manipulated the growing excitement. Press and pulpit whipped up the frenzy. Out of that frenzy, the Indians were to end up dead or exiled, the land speculators richer, the politicians more powerful. As for the poor white frontiersman, he played the part of a pawn, pushed into the first violent encounters, but soon dispensable. Now, let's go to page 143 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Private contracts were made for the march, the same kind that had failed for the Choctaws. Again, delays and lack of food, shelter, clothing, blankets, medical attention. Again, old, rotting steamboats and ferries, crowded beyond capacity, taking them across the Mississippi. By midwinter, the interminable stumbling procession of more than 15,000 creeks stretched from border to border across Arkansas. Starvation and sickness began to cause large numbers of deaths. The passage of the exiles could be distinguished from afar by the howling of trailing wolf packs and the circling flocks of buzzards, Van Every writes. 800 Creek men had volunteered to help the United States Army fight the Seminoles in Florida in return for a promise that their families could remain in Alabama, protected by the federal government until the men returned. The promise was not kept. The Creek families were attacked by land-hungry white marauders, robbed, driven from their homes, women raped. Then the army, claiming it was for their safety, removed them from Creek country to a concentration camp on Mobile Bay. Hundreds died there from lack of food and from sickness. Now, let's go to page 146. Meanwhile, the Cherokees had not fought back with arms, but had resisted in their own way. And so the government began to play Cherokee against Cherokee, the old game. The pressures built up on the Cherokee community, their newspaper suppressed, their government dissolved, the missionaries in jail, their land parceled among whites by the land lottery. In 1834, 700 Cherokees, weary of the struggle, agreed to go west. 81 died en route, including 45 children, mostly from measles and cholera. Those who lived arrived at their destination across the Mississippi in the midst of a cholera epidemic, and half of them died within a year. The Cherokees were summoned to sign the removal treaty in New Ekataw, Georgia, in 1836, but fewer than 500 of the 17,000 Cherokees appeared. The treaty was signed anyway. The Senate, including Northerners who had once spoken for the Indian ratified it, yielding, as Senator Edward Everett of Massachusetts said, to the force of circumstances, the hard necessity. Now the Georgia whites stepped up their attacks to speed the removal. Now, let's go to page 147, towards the bottom of the page, and continuing on to page 148 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Some Cherokees had apparently given up on nonviolence. 3 chiefs who signed the removal treaty were found dead, but 17,000 Cherokees were soon rounded up and crowded into stockades. On October 1st, 1838, the first detachment set out in what was to be known as the Trail of Tears. As they moved westward, they began to die of sickness, of drought, of the heat, of exposure. There were 645 wagons and people marching alongside. Survivors, years later, told of halting at the edge of the Mississippi in the middle of winter, the river running full of ice. Hundreds of sick and dying penned up in wagons or stretched upon the ground. Grant Foreman, the leading authority on Indian removal, estimates that during confinement in the stockade or on the march westward, 4,000 Cherokees died. In December 1838, President Van Buren spoke to Congress. It affords sincere pleasure to apprise the Congress of the entire removal of the Cherokee Nation of Indians to their new homes west of the Mississippi. The measures authorized.
Casey Waters Show. Producer, Casey Waters. Graphic editing, Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, CaseyWaters2 at CaseyWaters.com.